go. All right. Just give me a couple of minutes. Hey, y'all. Just having a little bit of fun today. What's going on? It's Jackie Luqman. And I'm going to have a little bit of fun today. Hopefully, going to have a little conversation about one of our favorite shows, Lovecraft Country on HBO. Um, just letting you know, there are going to be spoilers. So, if you have not watched the show, um, if you have not watched the last two episodes, especially, you do not want to watch this video because there will be spoilers. Trying to tell you, there will be spoilers. If you don't want to watch this, if you haven't seen the last two episodes of Lovecraft Country, telling you again, don't watch this video. Just popping it into a couple of places. See if I can get the comments. Hey y'all. Hey Miriam. Um, yeah, this is I was watching the last two episodes of Lovecraft Country, um, Abdus and I, and like episode 9, episodes 8, 9, and the last one, 10, I think. Especially the episode that highlights the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, otherwise known as the massacre at of Black Wall Street. Um, Great episode. Again, as people are joining, thanks Chanel. Uh, as people are joining, I gotta warn you again, there will be spoilers about Lovecraft Country, the HBO series that I didn't even know was actually based on a book. I had never heard of the book Lovecraft Country. I didn't know anything about it. I just saw that there was this series, this new sci-fi series that HBO was doing. Um, Lovecraft was in the title, and black folks were in it. And so I said, let's see what that's about. Cause see, me and Abdus are sci-fi junkies. We love good science fiction, not just any science fiction. You can't, run anything past us. It's got to be good science fiction. And we have been really enjoying Lovecraft Country from the perspective of science fiction fans. But as is always the case, it is difficult to watch these kinds of things when you have a certain political um, understanding. It's difficult to watch this kind of stuff and not see politics in everything because let's be really clear. All entertainment is propaganda, at least in this country. I don't know about other countries, but in the United States, all entertainment, all media is propaganda. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's print media. I don't care if it's billboard ads. I don't care if it's radio. It's all propaganda. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what message are they trying to convey, and who is trying to convey the message? Who benefits from it, and all that good stuff. So I really feel like, excuse me, the first couple of episodes, well, not, I'm sorry, not the first couple of episodes, but the last two episodes of Lovecraft Country were just full of a lot of that kind of propaganda that was both really good in some ways and really, really kind of problematic in other ways. So, again, for the third time, this is the last time I'm going to say it. If you have not seen Lovecraft Country, if you have not seen the last two episodes, don't watch this video because I'm giving spoilers. All right. So tonight, I just want to talk about the episode that focused on the massacre and the destruction of what is called Black Wall Street, which is the Greenwood, the section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, that's called Greenwood, that was called Greenwood, and it was an all black town, um, very successful, lots of businesses, lots of upstanding black folks. And you get that sense in the episode in Lovecraft Country where they talk about the massacre. And just like with HBO's Watchmen, the reboot of the movie The Watchmen, which I didn't like the movie, but I liked the reboot very much. It dealt with uh, the Tulsa Massacre, and it was centered around reparations that were paid to black people because of the Tulsa Massacre specifically. So Lovecraft Country focuses on that incident, not the last episode that aired last night, but the episode before last night. Last week's episode dealt with the Tulsa Massacre, the Tulsa race riot, or the destruction of Black Wall Street. Excuse me. Now, the, I love the writing and the acting for the most part for the series. I do love how very early in the series the issue of H.P. Lovecraft's racism is dealt with. It's in like the first or second episode in the series where the issue of Lovecraft racism is raised, and a very racist poem that he wrote is recited on the episode. So just the idea that the stories that came from H.P. Lovecraft that he made famous are being used and turned on their head, as they're being told from the perspective of black people's experience in this country, which gives us the perspective that maybe it's not the monsters in H.P. Lovecraft's stories that are coming to life, that are so terrifying. Maybe for black people the monsters are white people. Maybe for black folks the monster is racism. So I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition of Lovecraft's very real life racism, the very real life racist poem he actually did write, his really wonderful science fiction stories that have endured time, and have been made into movies, some great, some not so great, and how black people kind of tangle with the great, what his imagination produced, which is really great if you're a science fiction fan, and what do we do with the racism that comes out of the same man's brain, right? So you get to the last two episodes where there's a whole bunch of historical stuff that is woven through the series, which has been really, I mean, it's been so great that the historical references that they've woven throughout the series that they were almost shocking the way they did it. And they did it in, I think, such a great science fiction kind of geeky, nerdy way that when we realized the things that were happening, we were kind of like blown away. Like here's a spoiler, again, another spoiler, but it's earlier in the series. There is a scene in one of the best episodes in the series in this season where there is a bunch of kids are playing with a Ouija board. And one of the kids asks the Ouija board if he will have a good time on his trip. And the Ouija board answers back no. If you're not paying attention to the episode, and I'm smiling because it was so brilliantly done, because that episode, I don't remember the name of the episode, but it is the episode in which Letty moves into the house in the all-white section of town, and the house is actually haunted with some really horrendous spirits that reflect real life horror that black people face at the hands of real life monsters, white racists. But the Ouija board scene is done so quickly, but it is woven into this excellent, really scary, spooky narrative about the ghosts that haunt this house, um, that unless you're paying attention, you miss it. And then when you go back and watch the episode, like we do quite frequently, because we do love our television. It's a great escape for us. When we go back and watch the episode, and we have an inkling of a recognition of something that looks familiar, and then we did, Abdus and I sat there and froze the frame of the kids playing with the Ouija board, and it was the kids' tie that clued us in to what they wove into that scene. The kid who asked the Ouija board if he would have a good time on his trip was Emmett Till. And I mean, I just got a tingle right there. I just got a tingle because it was so well done, that it was so just woven into the overall setting of the scene and the mood and what was about to happen next, which was a really great um, a display of horror movie kind of, haunted house kind of stuff. It was really cool. But it was so well done, and then when you realize they did it after the episode, it just made that episode so much more like punch in the gut. Like, damn, that was deep. Then when you look at everything else that happened in the episode, it just really blew my mind. And then it was kind of weird because the episode after that was not that great, I didn't think. But a later episode, I think it was the two episodes later, picks up on that theme of Emmett Till and the murder of Emmett Till, and the way that white society terrorized black children. And that's where we see the two amazing young dancers, the twins, who were I just, it was just so much. I'm going into a whole bunch of stuff that is not the stuff that I want to talk about, but you have to watch Lovecraft Country in order to understand why these things matter, why that what they and how they made you feel, and how the writers and the actors and the performances really did a good job in weaving in to this science fiction narrative real life examples of why, for black people, it's not made up monsters in novels from H.P. Lovecraft that make life scary for us, even though some of those monsters come to life. It is the racism that lived in the mind and the heart of H.P. Lovecraft himself that is our monster every day. That's the overall theme, I think, of Lovecraft Country. But the episode about Tulsa, the Tulsa Massacre, was, I thought, really, really good on several levels. The acting is amazing. The trauma, I feel like the trauma that we saw, one of the main characters relive. As he is having to go back in time to Tulsa to retrieve something that's important to the rest of the story. And just the fact that people who didn't experience the massacre in the story didn't kind of consider the trauma that a survivor of the massacre would have to deal with in being asked to go back to that time and that place and relive that horrendous thing all over again. You get a sense of that. You get a sense of the of one of the main characters' backstory, that speaks to another kind of trauma that we experience, especially in our community, with black men, just how black men have been so conditioned by a very racist, very white male patriarchal controlled society to be brutal to our children who are different, to our boy children who are different, and the scars that leaves. I feel like the episode on the Tulsa Massacre was really well done, and I had to make some notes because I'm telling you, there's so much in this thing. Um, it didn't just show the massacre as it happened. Like when it talked about when the episode went into the massacre, it didn't just show the carnage of white people destroying Greenwood, which is what Watchmen did. And while Watchmen, it was great that they even had a representation on any screen of the Tulsa massacre. It was of the massacre itself. And to me, that kind of keeps the black residents of that community in this little box, in this little bubble of the people who were massacred, right? So that's all you know of or think of them. But what I think Lovecraft Country did that was better than that was they showed black people living in Greenwood before the massacre happened. They showed people going to work. They showed the shopkeepers. They showed teenagers shopping for their prom outfits and flowers. And we get a little bit of the history of about what happened right before the massacre happened in Greenwood. And I feel like this is very important because people like to take black people out of the context of humanity and put us into these historical atrocities, and that's all we are to some people. Are victims of historical atrocities. Not that that's not important, but that is not all of who we are, because what we learn from this episode is that right before, hours before, white people, mobs of hundreds, if not thousands of white people converged upon Greenwood and started massacring people and burning down homes and businesses and church. Well, they left one church standing, and schools and things. There was a high school prom that day. The day of the first day of the massacre, there was a prom scheduled at Booker T. Washington High School, and hours before, white people converged upon the town to slaughter hundreds of black people. Booker T. Washington High School had to cancel their prom because someone somewhere heard that there was going to be some trouble from the white people across the tracks. So you get that tidbit of information in the series, and you see how, the kids were dressing up to go to prom. They were getting their flowers. The boys were giving girls their corsages, and how there's an opening scene where the characters go back in time to the day of the massacre, where two girls are walking in down the hall in an apartment building, and one girl says they canceled the prom. White people won't leave us alone, but I don't understand why they had to cancel the prom though, and I look so pretty in my prom dress. For me, showing us living was so... I'm just getting a little emotional thinking about what was destroyed, who white people destroyed when they massacred the people of Greenwood, Oklahoma. It wasn't just, a successful black town. They massacred people. They murdered human beings. And I felt like it was incredibly important and so incredibly noteworthy that the writers and the directors and everybody who had anything to do with the decision making of this episode of Lovecraft Country showed that black people living in Greenwood before they were massacred by white people. The violence that they showed, I am glad that in typical sci-fi fashion, at least in typical sci-fi fashion in the modern era, they didn't shy away from the brutality of the violence that white people unprovoked committed against black people, shooting people down in the street. But I also love that they showed black folks shooting back, defending their homes and communities. But they were simply just literally outgunned by white people. And they showed the two airplanes that dropped bombs on the community and further hastened the entire destruction of the entire community. Again, with the exception of one church that they left standing. I also love that they showed the looting that white people committed against black businesses and homes. If you Google Red Summer of 1919 and looting, you'll find a few pictures like from Chicago of homes that white people broke into, beat, assaulted, dragged out, and even murdered the black residents and stole their belongings, looted their homes. This happened across the country. And I was so glad that the people involved with this episode showed white people looting black businesses, committing property damage against black businesses and homes. And I feel like this is especially important that they did this now while we are in the middle of this uprising where the media that is supposed to be, even the so-called liberal media, is complicit in conveying this narrative that the protests that are happening, the anti-racist, anti-fascist protests that are happening across the country are violent, that there's all this property damage being committed. First of all, it's not true. There has been some property damage in a few, literally like less than 3%, I think, of the protests, and there have been at least 10,000 protests since the public execution of George Floyd happened back in May of this year. 10,000 protests across the country in every single state in the country. And most of those protests, the vast majority of those protests, have not been have been incident free in regard to protesters committing any property damage or anything like that. What has happened in most of these protests, in a much more significant percentage of these protests, is that right-wing counter-protesters have come out and have confronted and assaulted and intimidated protesters, and the police have intimidated and assaulted protesters and provoked them. And then the media has picked up on that and said, oh, the protesters clashed with police, when the protesters weren't clashing with anybody. The police were beating the hell out of the protesters, and they were allowing these right-wing citizens, who were usually armed with golf clubs, baseball bats, guns, and sometimes just their fists, to intimidate, assault, and sometimes kill protesters. So I thought it was extremely important that Lovecraft Country showed the scene of white people smashing the windows of black businesses and stealing items out of the businesses, looting. Because look, let's just be clear on something. I don't care how much looting and rioting black people do, or indigenous people do, or Chicano people do in the pursuit for justice and freedom in this country. Collectively, we can never ever loot as much as what's been stolen from us. Not ever in our lifetime can we ever, in anybody's protest, loot as much as what's been stolen from us. So I big kudos to Lovecraft Country for showing the scenes of white people stealing, looting, rioting and looting in a black community. The issue of the migration of survivors from Tulsa was also a point that was made in this episode, which is important. I think it's very important because we always talk about these incidents of mass racist violence committed against black communities, even though there are, tens of black people up to hundreds and sometimes thousands, we honestly don't know how many black people white mobs have murdered throughout this history of racist mob violence in, excuse me, excuse me, ooh, sorry, in the 1920s and during that era. Because, I mean, who actually kept accurate records of how many black people and indigenous people and Chicano people and other immigrants that white people killed, when the people who were participating in the massacres were the cops, were the sheriffs, were the judges, the juries were letting these people off. The politicians were giving them political cover. So I don't know why we expect that we will ever know how many black people, how many non-European people of color that white folks in this country have massacred. We'll never really know. But the issue of the migration of survivors of these uh, uh, acts of racist terrorism against black people was really important in this episode, because one of the survivors, and I wrote his name down, and I don't know why I can't, Montrose. Montrose was one of the survivors, along with one of the characters' mother, and who he thought was his uncle, but maybe he wasn't. They were survivors of Tulsa, and they left. They migrated to another place. So then that raises the issue of the trauma that black people endured, that they carried with them, having endured an act of violent racist terrorism like the Tulsa Massacre, then to go to another town, having been driven out of your hometown with nothing. Everything that you owned and built and worked so hard to develop was burned to the ground and stolen by white people, and you and your family, whoever were left, were driven out to another place. So you had to go and start over in another place with nothing except for the trauma that you carried with you from the hell that you experienced from that other place. And the other place that you go to, you have to continue to deal with the racist terrorism of the racist white people in that place. So that kind of leads to, at least from what I could, from what I saw, this propensity that black people have to be very stoic and almost what it seems like dismissive in the face of racism. That, I think, part of this response from us, yes, a part of it I think does come from the indoctrination that we get from the white supremacist interpretation of the Christian faith, and we're going to talk about that in another talk about another episode, because that is important. But when I look at the fact that Montrose and his brother and his brother's kind of childhood sweetheart survived Tulsa and had to go settle somewhere else, they brought with them the trauma of the fact that entire families were murdered by white people. There was nothing they could do to stop that from happening. And they saw firsthand with their own eyes the utter and sheer brutality and the just the callousness toward their lives, the bestiality, the monstrous nature of racist white people. And they had to go to another town with that trauma on their hearts and in their heads and deal with another group of racist white monsters in another town. So what black people learn to do is we learn to hide. We learn to put our heads down just so we can survive, because we've seen what white people will do if we walk with our backs too straight, if we strut too tall, if we feel like we've gotten above what they believe our station to be, we've seen how they will cut us down. So I thought that was really that was just that was heavy to watch. And the character who plays Montrose, Michael T. White, I think his name is. He the iconic played the iconic role of Omar in The Wire. One of our favorite actors, me and Abdus. He played the hell out of that role as he is reliving the trauma and the terror of surviving the Tulsa Massacre as a child, and also surviving the childhood trauma of his own personal struggle. That, oh my God, it's a lot in that episode that is done so incredibly well that I cannot speak of highly enough. But, in typical Luqman Nation fashion, there's always some stuff that's like, say what? Okay, this is a problem because, listen, like we said, all entertainment in this country at least is propaganda. And there's some real serious problems with this episode that focused on the Tulsa Massacre that I think we really, really need to talk about. Because, listen, Michael Williams, thank you, Miriam. Michael Williams. Abdus and I are socialists. We're not just leftists. We ain't, because I don't even know what the left is these days. I don't know. So I like to be very clear about where our ideology is. We are socialists. We are pan-Africanists. We are anti-capitalists, and we are anti-imperialists. We view everything from that lens. So when we're watching this and we're kind of looking at it and we're thinking, this is a great episode that they're talking about what was done to our people in Tulsa. But why is it that people are only talking about the destruction of Greenwood, Oklahoma? Why is it that even when black people talk about the history of racist terrorism that we endure in this country, they always bring up Black Wall Street? And this gets our capitalist brain, our capitalist wheels churning. And this is what I think the issue is. I told you I got notes. I got notes here, y'all. Ooh, I got notes. So I think the issue is that these stories are being told about our history in a capitalist entertainment system. I don't know any other way to explain it, because Greenwood is not the only massacre of a black community that happened in this country. It certainly wasn't the only one that happened during that time. And let me show you what I mean. I hope you can see it. So, and this is just really a partial list, actually. This isn't even a complete list. It's just something I just Googled real quick because I saw that somebody posted this image on their Facebook wall, and I wanted to find it because I thought it was pretty indicative. It was a quick look at all of the massacres of black people that have been committed by white people in this country. And again, this isn't even all of them. But you look at how many are highlighted in just this map right here that represents the East Coast, the South, and the Midwest. Tulsa is right here in 1921. And, oh yeah, if you click on the dot, you get a little bit of a bigger map. There you go. And the site is called Decolonial Atlas, if you want to go take a look at this yourself. But you see, long before what happened in Tulsa, there were massacres of black people being committed by racist white people long before it. Down here in Vicksburg, Tennessee in 1874. In Thibodaux, Louisiana in 1887. Colfax, Louisiana in 1868. St. Bernard Parish in 1868. If St. Bernard Parish sounds familiar, it should. Think of it. You think of it when you hear uh, Katrina. Okay, look up Katrina and St. Bernard Parish. New Orleans, 1866. Uh, Ocoee, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in Florida, 1920. Atlanta, 1906. Wilmington, 1898. And if you think it's just the South, it's not just the South. How about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1985? Washington, D.C., 1919. Yes, y'all. White folks did that here in Washington, D.C. New York City, New York, 1863. Detroit, 1943. There is an entire history of racist white terrorism, violent racist white terrorism committed against entire black communities that people ignore because in a capitalist system, what they look at is like, what is the cost to capitalism that this atrocity presented? Do you understand what I'm getting at? I feel like the reason a lot of people focus on Black Wall Street when they talk about the history of racist white terrorism against entire black communities is because Black Wall Street is like the epitome of black success. It is like the talented tenth of black communities. Black Wall Street was like the acceptable black community in a capitalist system. Black Wall Street represents the epitome of what black people were supposed to aspire to. And oh, it is such a shame that white people destroyed this wonderful thing that black people created, but it is only presented as wonderful in the context of the capitalist success that black people achieved. That's why they call it Black Wall Street, because it was a community of wealthy black people. Right? So and by they I mean the entertainment industry and even a whole lot of black people don't talk about massacres like in Elaine, Texas, where sharecroppers, where dozens of black sharecroppers were lynched because they were advocating for fair cotton prices and to be paid directly for their crops rather than to get paid by the landlord. See, that doesn't, the Elaine massacre doesn't represent this, the epitome of capitalist success. That's just a bunch of, poor working class black folks struggling to eke out a living. And oh, it's so sad that they were massacred. But oh my God, look at all of the capitalist success that black people were able to achieve in Black Wall Street. No, that's the story we want to tell about the racist terrorism against black people, because it's an additional affront when one is able to achieve success within the confines of capitalism, and then white people come and destroy that. And I'm not saying at all that the massacre of black people in Greenwood is any less atrocious because they were so-called middle class or even rich black people. I am saying that the reason we only hear about Black Wall Street is because in this country we are all indoctrinated to think in terms of what does this mean in terms of capitalism. How successful were these people? How acceptable were these people? How upstanding were they? And when we talk about who is acceptable and who is upstanding, and who is, and what we call today the perfect victim, we always talk about how many degrees this person had, what kind of upstanding family they came from. Usually now, whether they went to church or not, but not as much. But definitely, we look at the level of education the person who is a victim of racist terrorism has, and what contribution they would have made to this capitalist society, whether they had worth or not in this capitalist society. So I feel like the focus on Greenwood, on the destruction of Black Wall Street, is not so much that you have Hollywood saying, and even some black people saying, look at the horrible violation of human rights that was committed by white people against black people. They're looking at it from the standpoint of, look at all of the success that black people achieved that white people destroyed. And they're looking at it from the framework of success being a reflection of monetary success, of success in a capitalist system. And that is a serious, serious problem. I know people are listening to this and they're just like, what? That is so weird and off base. But I really don't think it is, because if this were not the case, if the hyper focus on Tulsa, on Black Wall Street, were not a result of our capitalist indoctrination, then more black people would be focusing on the Elaine massacre, on the Colfax massacre, on all of the other on Rosewood, on all of the other massacres of all of the other black people around the country and all the other black communities around the country. One, it doesn't even have to be all of them, just one. But here we have in popular media another representation of the massacre of Black Wall Street. And I don't think that's, maybe it wasn't intentional from the writer's perspective that they meant to prop Black Wall Street up as, you know, this great crime against the capitalist success of black people. But that's the way it reads when you're interrogating media and you're thinking about it from the perspective of propaganda and what that means about who's telling our history and why, what message they're trying to convey. So then Black Wall Street and the destruction of it, that gets told and highlighted, and that's great. But then all of the other massacres of all of the other black communities that weren't as economically successful as Black Wall Street gets pushed off to the side. So I think that's a real problem. And you see in the episode the material success that black people in Black Wall Street had. You see the black women dressed in fine clothes and the jewelry stores with the fine jewelry, and, you know, the black people being waited on, having, you know, drivers and chauffeurs and living in, you know, beautiful spacious houses and, you know, having a little money. And I'm not at all saying that that is a bad thing. What I am saying again, and I'm hoping I'm making this kind of clear, I hope I'm making it clear, is that this representation of, you know, highlighting the destruction of Black Wall Street and focusing on the destruction, all it does is it focuses on the destruction of Black Wall Street as an examination of the crime of the destruction of the capitalist success of these people. And I think that also creates a problem when we're talking about issues like reparations, right? Because those sharecroppers who were slaughtered and those poor black folks who were slaughtered, the house cleaners, the drivers, the butlers, the cooks, the free people who were making their way post enslavement, doing what they had been forced to do before for free, but who were now making money off of it. They were targets of racist white terrorist violence too. But we don't talk about them and what the loss of their lives and their communities meant to their survivors, and the progeny of their survivors. So it kind of gives um, this it creates a narrative where you have a situation like with HBO's Watchmen, where reparations were given to the survivors and their descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre. But as far as we know, according to the story in Watchmen, they were the only black people who received reparations. That's the kind of problem this sort of hyper focus on Tulsa creates, because you set this community up as the acceptable victims, the victims that this society is willing to acknowledge because their capitalist success was destroyed by white people. So, okay, fine, we'll give them and their descendants and anyone we can prove was connected to those descendants reparations. But everybody else that we don't talk about, all of the survivors and their descendants and people who were connected to the other black communities and indigenous communities and Chicano communities who were the victims of mass mob racist white terrorist violence, well, we're not going to deal with them. And I hope that makes sense. In a capitalist system, even as the people right now are challenging this capitalist system to address the long-standing income inequality that stems from this racist history, this history of racist white terrorist violence, the system of capitalism is like, okay, fine. Will I shut you up if we acknowledge that, okay, fine, we'll give the folks from Tulsa, we'll give the survivors from the Tulsa Massacre reparations, because look, we can look and see that they have amassed some material success, and all right. But because we don't push to talk about all of the other incidents of racist terrorism in this country, these aren't addressed. The survivors of these events aren't addressed. Their descendants aren't addressed. The people who had to immigrate from these communities where these massacres happened, leaving these places with nothing but the clothes on their back and the trauma that they just witnessed, and having to go to another community that was controlled by racist white people, another group of monsters, and who were unable to gain a secure footing in life because of that. These people don't get dealt with. Just these. That's, I think, the great flaw in that episode of Lovecraft Country, and the hyper focus on the willingness to highlight the massacre of Black Wall Street now in popular entertainment, when there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other incidents, atrocities. Let me stop calling them incidents, because what they are is atrocities. When there are innumerable other atrocities committed by mobs of violent, racist white people against entire communities of people of color throughout history. So, so that is my take on that one episode. And I don't know, I have to look at my phone to see if anybody is hanging out with me on my page about this. Let's see, because I'm in the Facebook live thing, so I'm trying to see if anybody has any comments. If you have comments, please chime in with them, because I would love to hear what you think. If you've watched the episodes, if you have not watched the episodes, if you're interested in watching them, let me know. Let me know. And I thought I posted this doggone thing to my page, but I guess I didn't. So, yes, I did. I did so. Um, so let me see. I'm looking over here in the comments. Um, Miriam said, I guess we don't always think about the fallout after a tragedy like that. And you know what, Miriam? Here's the thing. I started thinking about that after, interestingly enough, I started thinking about this issue of uh, trauma and PTSD that regular folks experience after a tragedy after 9/11, because that's when people in this country started talking about trauma. Oh, the trauma of people who experienced 9/11 and who were there and who saw the towers fall and who saw the plane hit the Pentagon. I actually was at work not too far from the Pentagon the day one of the planes hit the Pentagon, and my aunt worked in the Pentagon. She was at work that day, and I'll never forget hearing on the radio in my office that a plane had hit the Pentagon, and we were watching on the news the towers in New York. The plane hit the towers in New York, and then we hear on the radio here in DC that a plane had hit the Pentagon, and I immediately thought of my aunt who was at work in the Pentagon, and I sent her an email. I called her 5 or 6 times. She didn't answer. I sent her an email, said, call me, call me, call me, call me, and the next I heard from her, she had gotten home. Excuse me, I went over to her house, and she was sitting on her bed in just covered in ash still from having to pick her way out of the partially collapsed section of the Pentagon that the plane hit. So I started thinking about PTSD that regular people endure after these kinds of catastrophic events and trauma, when my own family experienced it. And I heard white people talking about how, oh, the nation is suffering a collective PTSD and the nation is suffering a collective trauma. And of course they use that to justify the Iraq War and killing over 1 million Iraqis, innocent Iraqis. But then I started to think about this history that I do. I can't say that I love to research it. I feel like it's my duty. It is. I feel like it is my duty, and it is my job, and it is the debt I owe to my ancestors to know this history. I started thinking about trauma and PTSD in the context of what they endured having gone through all this, and then some of the behaviors that I've seen us exhibit in the Black community that really make no sense, that shouldn't be as they are. But when you think of them in terms of traumatized people trying to survive in a society that has already brutalized them and allowed the monsters who brutalized them to get away with it, are still having to survive in a society just in another geographic place where another group of monsters are brutalizing them and will get away with it. So they just learn to keep their head down, not make waves, and just survive another day. So I started thinking of that trauma, these atrocities in that context. So then I began to understand when I would hear people say that certainly Black people in this country, Africans in this country, are a traumatized people. And I think this is absolutely true throughout the diaspora because imperialism, white supremacy, colonialism, all wrapped up into enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, and honestly, just the reason that a diaspora of African people is as large and widespread as it is. Yeah, it is no doubt that some of the harmful indoctrination that we have received from the trauma from these atrocities and the ongoing trauma of trying to survive in a society in which the monsters who committed these atrocities not only are allowed to get away with it, but they're the ones who make the rules. They're the ones who make the laws and they interpret the laws and they enforce the laws and they punish the people who break the laws. And they're the ones who decide what's moral and what's not moral. And they're the ones who interpret the so-called faith of the nation. It's an ongoing trauma to live in a society in which the monsters that traumatized you are the ones who run the show. So, that is my take on the Tulsa Massacre episode of Lovecraft Country. Let me make sure I got everything I wanted to say about this episode, and I'm gonna save what I have to say about the whole dynamic between Ruby and her sister Letitia, Letty, and the dynamic between white women in general and the issue of racism in this series that I think I finally kind of rolled up in the last two episodes. I'm going to save that for another show because I think this was a lot. I do really hope that there are more factual, historically accurate representations of the way we tried so hard to live in this country after enslavement and before these massacres happened, during the period of these massacres, and how we have tried so hard to live after these massacres in this system in which capitalism has been made God by the monsters who committed these atrocities against us. Black Wall Street is not the only example of the racist white terrorist violence that this country has to atone for. Black Wall Street isn't the only it isn't the only acceptable example of the need for America to atone for what white people have done to entire black communities, and what this white society, what this capitalist society, what this white supremacist society has done to entire communities of black people. But that's the way I fear the historical telling of Greenwood is being used in the context of a capitalist society that decides what stories are worth being told and what messages are being conveyed about those stories that are told. So that's what I got to say about that. I love Lovecraft Country. I think it's a great series. We're going to keep watching it. We're excited about season 2. We hope there is a season 2. But stay tuned for the next episode in this little talk about dark-skinned black women, light-skinned black women, and white women. The strange love triangle that just never works out. I don't know. That's a weird name, but you get an idea about what I'm going to talk about next. But thanks, y'all. Drop your comments and appreciate it. Appreciate you watching. Follow us on patreon.com/Luqman Nation, LuqMannation. You can hear my monologues every day, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, on By Any Means Necessary. You can also find those monologues on our Spreaker account for Luqman Nation. The monologues are standalone, found on Spreaker. Sometimes I post the articles on our Patreon page, as well as the audio, and you can always follow us right here on Coffee, Current Events, and Politics and Luqman Nation, and subscribe to us on YouTube under Luqman Nation. All right, that's it for now. Thanks, y'all. Peace.